We now look at when trade will occur. In other words, when both the outer and inner transaction will be complete. The starting point is to think about all the costs involved in getting content to a consumer and completing these transactions. A first set of costs is, of course, you have to create the content in the first place. We'll call these creation costs. A second set of costs is the costs associated with getting already created content to the consumer. These are distribution costs. Obviously, you can imagine that these have changed quite considerably since the advent of digitization. A book used to have to be a physical printed copy delivered to consumers. Now, of course, it can be all done digitally. A third set of costs are the costs associated with search. You could think of this as shopping, but basically this is when the consumers have to invest their own time and maybe other things in actually finding the content they want to consume. And the final set of costs are what we're going to call transaction costs. Once you want to actually get a trade done, there are costs you actually have to incur in terms of completing that transaction. In big contracts, that's legal costs. But even right down to digital transactions, there are all manner of costs associated with getting the deal done. Now you can cut these costs a number of ways. The traditional way you've been taught in economics to think about how you classify these costs is whether they're dependent or independent on the number of consumers who actually consume the content. You can see the creation costs have to be incurred whether you've got one person you're creating something for or hundreds or thousands. It's all the same. Now, of course, you may choose to spend more on creation when you know you've got a big audience. But the principle is that the costs, whatever they are to create a given set of content, are going to be the same regardless. The other costs are all related to the number of consumers. So if N is the number of consumers, the total transaction costs, the total search costs, and the total distribution costs rise as you add more and more consumers. They might rise more quickly if it's harder and harder to reach consumers, or they might rise small, at a diminishing rate if there are, for instance, economies of scale. Now, this way of dividing things up is actually very useful when you're thinking of pricing to each consumer. Okay. What else have we got? What other classifications are there? There are, of course, classifications where some of the costs are incurred up front and some of them are incurred upon transacting. This is why the inner and outer transaction framework has a lot of power. Creation costs have to be done before you get to transact with any consumer. You have to create what you have to sell. It's endemic to a lot of things, of course. Search costs have to be incurred before you actually find the content you want to produce. That's the very definition of search costs. By contrast, transaction costs and distribution costs, they actually get incurred once a deal is actually done. And then you have to do that. Now, doesn't mean they don't take those into account. It just means that you're not going to incur those costs until you actually got a deal done. It makes them, this distinction, you can imagine, makes those costs a lot safer than the costs you incur up front in terms of your ability to recruit them. Another way of looking and dividing up the costs is, of course, costs borne by the content provider and costs borne by consumers. We normally think of the cost of creation, certainly, and the cost of distribution as borne by the content provider. We tend to de-emphasize some of the costs that are borne by consumers. Transaction costs, all the way to filling in your credit card details and setting up an account and other things you might need to do. And search costs, certainly. They are, by definition, incurred by consumers. Again, content providers may do things that diminish all of these costs, but whatever costs there are, this is how they're borne. Okay, so what does it take for trade to occur? Well, trade occurs if we can imagine that the total value of all the consumers was N times V, then if that total value is greater than the total costs in getting the content to them, including the cost of creation, we expect that a trade might occur. Like this. To put this in notation, what we're saying is N times V, the number of consumers times their value, has to be greater than all of these costs added together. Of course, consumers do have different values and other things like that. This is admittedly a stylized representation. If we actually do the way we normally think about these things, we normally think of the consumer side stuff as being one component and the producer side stuff as being the other. So the consumer side stuff is of course the value they receive, but you have to take away the cost that they would have to face in search and transaction in actually finally consuming the good. The stuff that the producer bears goes on the other side, and trade means that the stuff that the consumer incurs has to, in total, in net, outweigh the amount the producer incurs. We can collect our terms, simple algebra, and this basically gives us the demand curve. Okay? Normally the idea is that the individual consumer will more likely to consume if price is low and less likely if price is high. The demand curve is made up of all of these components in terms of their value they get from content, less these things like search costs and transaction costs. We can graph this in the usual manner, where we put the quantity that's demanded, N times D, on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. And the blue curve there, blue line in this case, indicates the demand curve. And the red line indicates the marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve is as you add more sales, what happens to total costs? Well, here, the only thing that changes is the cost of distribution. The content creation costs we've put off to the side there, but we're going to have to worry about them. If you charge a simple price, the profit you'll make is highlighted by this blue rectangle here. That's total revenue less total cost, not taking into account the cost of creation. So if you had to charge the same price for all consumers, that profit has to outweigh the upfront costs of getting into the business in the first place, creating the content. I know I've been a bit funny here, comparing a rectangle to a number, but you understand that it's the area of the rectangle that's being compared, and that is a numerical thing. Of course, this highlights some of the issues. For instance, the total value created net of all these costs is in fact this green triangle, which encompasses the profits of the firm. But if the firm only prices a certain amount, say above marginal cost like this, then you're not going to realize that entire triangle. What we'd like is you can see what the problem with that is. The firm, when it's going to be thinking about, do I actually create this content up front, it's going to think about the price they can charge and the profits they earn, so we'll be thinking about the rectangle and not the triangle. But the triangle contains components that the consumer values, and also another component that is the missed opportunity. Because price is above marginal cost, there's some consumers who would otherwise be economic in terms of purchasing the content, but somehow choose not to. So what we'd like to get a situation is where content is created based on this equation rather than purely the profit equation.